I'm 40. My life is full. I don't need this.
Full or just heavy?
I'm 40, she said. My season is over. Sade Brooks had buried her sister, raised her child, and built a career with hands that never stopped working. She didn't need love. She needed time, and she was already out of it. Then they wheeled him in, and Jin-Ho Kang, the most dangerous man in Atlanta, looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth surviving for. Full, he said quietly, or just heavy. She had no answer for that. Neither did the part of her that already knew the difference. If this story already has you, hit that subscribe button right now and join the Christy J Story family. Every subscriber helps me keep telling stories like this one. Okay, let's go. Imagine standing outside a hospital at noon with a 3-year-old on your hip and nowhere else to be. The child is asleep, her whole body heavy against your chest. The way toddlers go heavy when they trust you completely, when the idea of being dropped has never once occurred to them. Her small fist is curled in the fabric of your scrubs. You don't move it. You are 40 years old. You have been a surgeon for 11 years, a sister for 37, and a mother, because that is what you are, regardless of what the paperwork still says, for 3. You have not slept more than 5 hours in a single stretch since the night you drove 2 hours in the rain and found this child in an apartment that smelled like old takeout and something worse. 3 days old, wrapped in a bathroom towel, alone. You have not cried since the funeral. You don't think about love. You think about the adoption hearing in 6 weeks. You think about the pediatric follow-up on Thursday. You think about whether Zari's vocabulary is on track, and whether the daycare has her allergy form on file, and whether the ceiling leak in the kitchen counts as a habitability issue for the home study. You do not think about love because love is a luxury, and you are not a woman who wastes things. You've made your peace with this. That's what you tell yourself, standing in the noon light with your sister's daughter breathing against your neck. That's the part that isn't true. She saved his life on a Tuesday. She didn't know who he was. She didn't have time to know who he was. She had 3 minutes between the ambulance radio call and the gurney hitting the bay doors. And in those 3 minutes, she pulled on gloves, called for 2 units of O-neg, and told her resident to clear the room. He came in gunshot, left side, close range. The kind of wound that means whoever did it was either very angry or very professional. His vitals crashed. His blood pressure read 47 over nothing. 4 men in dark suits tried to follow the gurney through the bay doors, and her security team physically held them back. And not one of those 4 men made a sound. They just stood there, still. The way people stand still when they have already decided what happens next, and are simply waiting for the room to agree. Sade did not look at them. She looked at the man on her table. He was not conscious. He was not unconscious either. He was somewhere between. That particular gray country that surgeons know and patients never remember. His jaw was set even there. His hands, she noted in the 2 seconds it took to check his pulse manually, were still. She worked for 94 minutes. Afterward, she handed off to the attending, washed her hands twice the way she always did, and walked 3 floors up to collect Zari from the hospital daycare. This was the arrangement on her late Tuesday shifts. Zari had her own bag there, her own small blanket. The daycare staff knew her name and her snack preferences, and that she didn't like loud noises. Sade sat down in the break room chair with Zari in her lap and began softly humming. It was not a conscious choice. She had been humming this particular song since the night she brought Zari home. Her sister's song, the one her sister used to hum in the car, off-key and unself-conscious, the way people sing when they've forgotten anyone is listening. 3 floors down, the team moved Jin-Ho to recovery. His eyes were not fully open, but he could hear. The hospital was old, the walls were thin. The sound traveled the way sound travels in old buildings, not loudly, just inevitably. He heard it. A woman's voice, low and steady, humming something he knew. He knew it because his younger sister Yi-Jin had hummed it too, the same melody, in the last months before he lost her. She used to hum it to her daughter, who had just started pulling herself upright against the furniture, who had her mother's ears and her father's stubbornness and 11 months of a whole life ahead of her. Jin-Ho Kang lay in that recovery room and did not move for a long time. His second-in-command, Min-Jun, appeared in the doorway. "You're stable," he said. Jin-Ho didn't respond. He was listening to the shape of the humming that had stopped, the particular quality of it, the melody he hadn't heard in 3 years. "The surgeon," he said. His voice was dry. Every word cost something. "Who is she?" Min-Jun checked his phone, too quickly, the way someone checks when they already know the answer. "Dr. Sade Brooks, trauma, 9 years here, no flag." "No flag," Jin-Ho repeated. He closed his eyes. "Find out if she has a daughter." Min-Jun left without a word. Jin-Ho lay in the dark and listened to the silence where the humming had been. He didn't notice the way Min-Jun had not needed to look at his phone for very long at all. The next morning, a gift appeared on the nurse's station desk outside the pediatric daycare. A small plush dragon, dark green, Zari's name on the card, the right spelling, the right pronunciation noted in parentheses, in handwriting that was small and deliberate and belonged to someone who did not send things without meaning to. She found the dragon on a Wednesday and told herself it was hospital protocol. Patients sent gifts. It happened. It happened less often when they addressed the gift to a child no one in that hospital officially knew by name. She noticed the security detail 3 days after that. She wouldn't have. She was not someone who paid attention to parked cars or men near elevator banks, because those things had never been her problem. But one of them moved. She was coming out of an on-call room at 6:15 in the morning, an impossible shift behind her, an impossible shift ahead, and a man she had never seen before stepped cleanly between her and a family member who had been escalating about discharge paperwork for 20 minutes without anyone telling her. The interaction lasted 4 seconds. The man returned to his position near the elevator. Sade followed him with her eyes. She counted 3 of them by noon. Jin-Ho's follow-up appointment was that afternoon. She walked in without sitting down and said, "Call them off." He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided is worth looking at. Not a question, not a challenge, just steady. "They're not going to interfere with your work," he said. "I know," she said. "Because you're going to call them off, or I will start referring to your gunshot wound as a workplace injury in my notes and let you explain that to whoever audits this hospital. Your choice." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the thing that comes before a smile in a man who has forgotten how. "You saved my life," he said. "I don't know how to do nothing with that." She had an answer prepared. She had prepared it in the elevator on the way up. It was professional and clear and left no room for a follow-up. She didn't say it, because behind her, Zari had dropped her dragon, the green one, and before Sade could turn around, Jin-Ho leaned forward and picked it up. He handed it back to the child with both hands. The way you hand something back to a child when you understand that the thing matters because it matters to them. Zari looked at him for a long 3 seconds. The particular gravity of a toddler deciding something important. Then she took the dragon and walked back to Sade's side. Sade watched this and said nothing. She went home that evening to find an envelope slid under her apartment door. No return address, no postage. Inside, 3 photographs of her and Zari, taken outside the hospital, today, close enough to read Zari's expression. She sat on the kitchen floor with the photographs in her hand. She did not sleep that night. And somewhere across the city, a man typed a message to a contact. Not a Guang number, a number that, if Jin-Ho had ever thought to check it, he would have recognized immediately. He had never thought to check it. He trusted the man who held it completely. She called him at 7 in the morning, not because she wanted to, because she had run through every other option in the cold arithmetic of the early hours, hospital security, the police, her building management, and understood that none of them were asking the right question. The right question was not who had taken the photographs. The right question was why. He answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "Someone is watching me. The photographs were taken yesterday. I need to know if this is connected to you. A pause. Not the kind that means someone is deciding whether to lie, the kind that means someone is deciding how much truth to give at once. Yes, he said. They met at a park in Buckhead at noon. He arrived before her. No security visible, though she had stopped believing that absence meant absence. He sat on a bench near the fountain, not looking at his phone. He watched Zari toddle toward the sandbox with the focused attention of someone watching something they're trying to memorize. Sade sat. Tell me, she said. He told her about the Guang syndicate. He told her who they were, what they had done to his operation in the last 18 months, and why the man on her table last Tuesday had been shot by someone who was not finished. He said all of this in the same unhurried tone he used for everything. She listened the way she listened to difficult diagnoses, without flinching. Flinching didn't change the information. Then he stopped. Across the park, Zari pressed her palm into a soft patch of ground, fascinated by something only a 3-year-old could find fascinating. You lost someone, Sade said. She had seen it in his face the first afternoon in her consultation room. That expression, the one that doesn't belong to the present moment. He was quiet for a long time. A niece, he said. 11 months old. Her mother was my younger sister, Yi-Jin. He said the name carefully, the way you say the name of someone you have not allowed yourself to say out loud in a long time. The Guang syndicate, he said. 3 years ago. I was supposed to move them that night. He stopped. I was late. 2 words. 3 years of weight inside them. Sade did not offer condolences. She had learned, in years of delivering the worst news a person could receive, that condolences were for the person giving them. She sat with him in the silence the way she sat with patience when presence was the only thing she had left to offer. Zari knocked over the small mound she had been building and laughed, the full, delighted laugh of a child who finds destruction as satisfying as creation. Jin-Ho watched her. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, just for a moment. The way a room changes when a window opens, not dramatically, just a difference in the air. Sade saw it. She filed it away with the other things she didn't have answers for yet. Across the park, a man in a gray jacket lowered his camera. He typed one line to his contact. Confirmed. She's the one. He brought her to the open. Then below it, moved to phase 2. Before we keep going, if this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest, hit subscribe right now and join the Christy J Story family. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it means everything to me. Alright, let's go back to Sade. She told him about her sister on a Thursday. Not the version she gave colleagues, the clean one, the one that ended with, and I took the child in, of course. The real one. The one that started 7 years earlier with a phone call at 2 in the morning and a sister who was using again, and a pattern that repeated itself with such reliable cruelty that Sade had stopped being surprised and started only being exhausted. She told him about the last 2 years, the calls she'd answered and the ones she hadn't. The night she drove 4 hours round trip to bring groceries and found her sister lucid and grateful and, she had really believed, finally turning a corner. The corner did not come. She told him about the night she got the call. She had been on call. She had been mid-surgery. She could not leave. By the time she reached the apartment, it had been 3 days. Zari was in the bathroom, wrapped in a towel that someone had left with her, she never found out who. 3 days old. Alive, by margins that still made Sade's hands shake when she let herself think about them. She told him all of this, and she did not cry. Jin-Ho listened without moving. He made none of the sounds people make when they are being polite about someone else's pain. He didn't look at her with that expression, half pity, half relief that it wasn't them. He just listened. The way someone listens who understands that the most useful thing they can do right now is not disappear. When she finished, he said, "She survived because of you. That's not luck. That's not proximity. That is specifically you, who you are, and what you do with the hours other people sleep through." Sade looked at him across the table. She realized she had not been seen, like this, by someone with no obligation, no history, no reason, in longer than she could calculate. He told her about Yi-Jin then, the full version, the night he was supposed to move them, the reason he was late, the 14 minutes that separated what happened from what might have been. He said it without asking for absolution. He told her because she had just shown him something true, and he owed her the same. "I won't be late again," he said quietly. "Not for you, not for her." Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. The voice was smooth, unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided something about her before she ever picked up. "Dr. Brooks, we hear you've been spending time with dangerous men. Child Services will be very interested to know." The line went dead. Sade lowered her phone. Jin-Ho's hands, resting flat on the table, went completely still in the way things go still right before they move. She didn't know in that moment that someone had already opened the file, that a supervisor had already handed Ms. Hartwell a case number with Zari's name on it, that the call to Child Services had not come from the Guang Syndicate's offices. It had come from a phone registered 3 blocks from Jin-Ho's own building. The investigator arrived on a Monday morning. Her name was Ms. Hartwell. She was professional and unhurried, and she carried a folder that was too thick to be preliminary and too organized to be random. She sat in Sade's living room and asked her questions in the tone of someone who had asked them many times before, and she wrote down the answers in small, neat handwriting that told Sade absolutely nothing about what she was thinking. Sade answered everything. She kept her voice level. She showed the room where Zari slept, the correctly installed safety outlet covers, the age-appropriate books, the doctor's number on the refrigerator, the emergency contact list with 4 names on it, laminated, because Sade did not do things halfway. Ms. Hartwell wrote things down. At the end, she mentioned the anonymous tip. She did not specify its contents. She said only that it raised questions about the suitability of Sade's current associations for the child's welfare. She said this in the same tone she used for everything else. And that was the most frightening thing about it. The way it sounded like paperwork. The way the thing that could destroy everything sounded, in this woman's mouth, like procedure. She left at 11:45. Sade closed the door and stood in her hallway. Then she called Jin-Ho. "You need to disappear," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady on purpose. "Whatever this is between us, it needs to stop. I cannot lose her. Do you understand what I'm saying? I cannot lose her." He was quiet. "Jin-Ho, if I walk away right now," he said, "they win, and you know it." She hung up. She went to the bathroom, turned the shower on, and sat on the edge of the tub and cried. The kind of crying that doesn't announce itself, that comes from the place you have kept bolted shut for 3 years because there was always something that needed doing and someone who needed you to hold it together. Zari was asleep down the hall. The white noise machine hummed through the wall. Sade sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried until she was empty. It was the first time she had cried since the funeral. She had seen something during Ms. Hartwell's visit. The folder had opened for just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. A sticky note on the inside cover. Small, neat. 2 words and a dash. Guang, confirmed. She found out on a Wednesday. Her lawyer called at 9 in the morning and the conversation that should have taken 2 minutes took 12. And at the end of it, Sade stood in the hospital parking garage with her keys in her hand and her coffee going cold. Her retainer? Paid. In full. By a corporate account she did not recognize. She drove to his building. The man at the desk knew her face before she gave her name. She stood in the lobby for 4 minutes before the elevator opened and she rode it to the 23rd floor and walked into a room where Jin-Ho stood at a window with his back to her. And she told him exactly what she thought of people who made decisions about her life without consulting her. He let her finish. She had noticed this early, how he listened. She had filed it with the wariness of a woman who had learned that men who listened were not always men who heard. When she finished, he turned from the window. "You have spent 3 years," he said. Making sure that child never wakes up afraid. He looked at her steadily. Let me do this one thing. The fury did not leave her face. She was not a woman who performed composure she didn't feel. But she didn't tell him to stop. She drove home. She sat in the parking garage for 6 minutes before going inside. She thought about her sister, who had spent her whole life waiting for someone to show up and never quite believed it when they did, and how that disbelief had become its own kind of damage. Sade had always thought she was different from her sister. She was beginning to wonder if she had been confusing strength with refusal. That evening, Jin-Ho's investigator called with results. The Guang syndicate had run surveillance on Atlanta General for 11 days. They held Zari's daycare schedule, her pickup time, the name of the daycare staff member who walked her to the lobby on Tuesdays. Jin-Ho said nothing for a long moment. How did they know she mattered? He said. Not a question. The investigator paused. Someone told them early, before you'd been seen together publicly. Someone who knew before the park. Before the park. Jin-Ho thought about who had known before the park. He thought about who had been in that recovery room on the first night. He set the phone down. He did not call Min-Jun. For the first time in 7 years, he filed a thought about Min-Jun in the place he kept things that were too dangerous to look at directly. They had her Tuesday route. They had her pickup window. And they had already chosen a day, 4 days away. He came to her on a Saturday at noon. Zari was napping. The apartment held that specific earned stillness that only came during nap time, the kind Sade had learned to use in the last 3 years for every difficult thing. Paperwork, phone calls, the kind of thinking that required the world to hold still for 20 minutes. Jin-Ho sat across from her at the kitchen table and placed the intelligence report between them and let her read it. She read it twice. She set it down. I want to offer you something, he said, and I need you to hear me before you answer. She waited. I can disappear, he said, from your life, completely. I can relocate the operation, remove the target from you, ensure that the Guang syndicate has no further reason to use you as leverage. A pause. I'm not asking you to choose me. I'm telling you there's a door, and it's open. Sade looked at him across the table. She thought about her sister. She thought about the vow she had made. Not the one at the funeral, the quiet public one, but the real one, in the car on the way back from the hospital with a 3-day-old baby strapped into a car seat she had bought at an all-night pharmacy because she hadn't owned one before that night. The vow that she would not let chaos back in. She had kept that vow for 3 years. She looked at Jin-Ho, this man who had paid her lawyer's retainer without asking for credit, and sent a stuffed dragon with the right name and the right spelling, and had sat on a park bench watching her niece play like he was memorizing something he was afraid of losing. And she thought about what it meant that she had kept chaos out for 3 years and still ended up here. Maybe she had been wrong about what chaos was. Maybe chaos wasn't the thing that came in uninvited. Maybe chaos was what happened when you kept the wrong things out for too long. If you leave, she said quietly, who teaches her that a man can stay? He went very still. The silence lasted 3 seconds. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something shifted in his face. That specific shift she had learned to read. He answered. Min-Jun's voice. Controlled. Tight. Boss, they moved early. Eyes on the hospital right now. Tonight. Jin-Ho stood. He looked at Sade once. Just once. He moved toward the door. He did not think, in that moment, about the fact that he had told no one except Min-Jun that he was at Sade's apartment today. No one except Min-Jun knew where he was. The face of a man who had been late once, and spent 3 years making sure he never would be again. He didn't know yet that he had never been late at all. She was mid-surgery when her phone vibrated. She couldn't look at it. She had a patient open on the table. Femoral bleed, 40 minutes in, and the work required everything she had and would require it for 20 more minutes at minimum. Her scrub tech looked instead. They had a protocol. Dr. Brooks, she said quietly. Your contact. He says now. Sade did not stop working. She finished the bleed. She closed. She was precise and fast, and when she stepped back from that table 22 minutes later, her hands were steady and her voice was steady for the handoff, and the only thing that was not steady was the space behind her sternum, which she had managed with everything she had for 22 minutes. She moved through the hospital quickly, without announcing it. 9 years in this building, she knew every shortcut, every service corridor, every stairwell, and she used 3 of them getting to the pediatric daycare on the 4th floor. The hallway outside was wrong. She knew it the moment she turned the corner. She couldn't name precisely what was wrong. The quality of the stillness, the way the afternoon light sat differently, the absence of the small daily sounds she had stopped consciously hearing years ago. She did not slow down. She went through the daycare door and found Jin-Ho's man inside. She knew him by now. She knew 3 of them by face. And found Zari in the far corner behind the reading shelf, calm, holding her green dragon with another of Jin-Ho's men crouched in front of her, voice low, posture careful. She's fine, he said. We got here first. Sade crossed the room in 4 steps and picked Zari up. Zari pressed her face into Sade's neck with the matter-of-fact trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt that her person will come. They were in a supply closet 2 corridors down when Jin-Ho found them. He had come himself. Not sent men and waited. Come himself, with a cut above his left eye that was still bleeding, and a quality of presence that told her exactly what the last 40 minutes had cost him. He looked at Zari first, then at Sade. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and Zari pressed against her chest, past shaking, through it and out the other side into the particular calm that follows when the emergency is over and the body hasn't caught up yet. He sat down on the floor across from her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He already knew she wouldn't answer that honestly, and she was grateful he knew it. They sat in the silence of the supply closet until Zari's breathing evened out. Then Min-jun's voice came through the radio. Guang's lead man is in custody. He's talking. What is he saying? Jin-Ho said. A pause, the kind that has weight behind it. The kind that means what comes next cannot be unheard. He's naming the inside source, Min-jun said. The one who gave them Dr. Brooks's schedule. The one who told them she mattered to you. Another pause. Boss. He's naming someone on your team. Who? Silence. Min-jun. He's confused, Min-jun said immediately. Too immediately. These people lie under pressure. You know that. They name anyone to buy themselves time. I've been with you 7 years. I know, Jin-Ho said. So answer me something. A beat. How did the Guang syndicate know she mattered to me before the park? Before anyone saw us together? Before there was anything to see? The silence that followed was different from the others. This one had a shape to it. Someone told them early, Jin-Ho said quietly. Someone who was in my recovery room the first night. Someone I sent to find out if she had a daughter. Nothing. Min-jun. A long breath, 7 years of loyalty exhaled in a single sound, and then, quietly, in the voice of a man who had just run out of road. How long have you known? Sade looked at Jin-Ho. His face had gone completely still, the stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he had been circling for weeks without letting himself see it directly. Yeah, Jin, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. You told them where she was. 3 years ago. You told them. The line held silence for a long time. You were going to leave the syndicate, Min-jun said finally. You were going to walk away from everything we built. I couldn't let you. Jin-Ho ended the call. He sat on the floor of that supply closet and he did not move. Zari slept against Sade's chest. Sade looked at him and said nothing. She had learned by now that there were moments when the most useful thing she could offer was not to disappear. She stayed exactly where she was. After a long time, he said, quietly, to no one, to the floor, to the 3 years of grief he had been carrying as guilt. I was late because he sent me the wrong location. I drove 40 minutes in the wrong direction. Silence. I wasn't late, he said. I was sent away. He closed his eyes. The man he had trusted most, the man who had stood in doorways and answered questions and been at his side through every year of the war he thought he had been fighting in his sister's name. The war that same man had started. Before I tell you how this ends, if you've made it this far with Shad, with Zari, with this man who just found out the truth he carried for 3 years was never his to carry, subscribe to Christy J Story right now. Join the Christy J Story family. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Here's how it ends. 3 months later, a new home, secure, warm, morning light through clean windows landing on everything it touched. Shad finalized Zari's adoption on a Thursday. She wore her sister's gold hoops. She cried in the judge's chambers without apologizing for it. Quietly, cleanly, the way you cry when the thing you fought for finally belongs to you on paper, the way it already belonged to you everywhere that mattered. Jin-Ho's legal team compiled 6 weeks of evidence and handed it to federal investigators. They fractured the Guang syndicate at its base. Min Jun was in custody. Jin-Ho didn't speak about it. Sade didn't ask him to. She understood by now the difference between things that needed to be said and things that needed to be survived. She gave him time. He gave her honesty. They were both still learning. That felt right to her. Now it was a Saturday morning. Cartoons from the living room, coffee on the counter. Jin-Ho on the kitchen floor building a block tower with Zari, who knocked it down every single time with the pure satisfaction of a child who had discovered that some things were more fun to destroy than to keep. Sade watched from across the kitchen with a mug in both hands. Zari reached up, both hands, no hesitation, the full assumption of welcome, and grabbed Jin-Ho's face. She studied him with enormous, serious eyes, the way she studied things she had already decided about. Jinny, she said. Jin-Ho went completely still. He looked across the kitchen at Sade. She looked back at him over the rim of her mug. She set it down. She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him on the floor. Nobody said anything. Zari placed the first block of the new tower with great ceremony. Then she knocked it down again. All 3 of them laughed. Jin-Ho looked at Sade over the top of Zari's head. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. Subscribe to Christy J Story, share this with someone who needs it today, and I will see you in the next one.